Hello, this is Professor Strickler, and this is Political Science 1101, American Government. This lesson is from Unit 1, Theories of Government, and it's Lesson 13 about modern liberalism. In this lesson, you'll learn about a philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is in some way the father of modern liberalism. You'll learn about the relationship that he saw between equality and freedom. You'll learn about the tenets of modern liberalism. In other words, its basic principles. You'll learn about liberalism's view of culture, and economics also is what we'll talk about, but they have a little bit different view of culture. And you'll also learn about the term progressive and what it has to do with modern liberalism. Now, what does it mean to be a liberal today compared to what it meant 200 years ago? A couple lessons ago, we talked about classical liberalism. Well, in this lesson, I'm going to explain to you what modern liberalism is. And you'll find that it has changed significantly in that time period. In some ways, liberalism has evolved to be just the opposite of what it was 200 years ago. And that may seem strange that something with the same name describing it could change so much. But to understand that, you've got to realize that both classical liberalism and modern liberalism see human freedom as their goal. They just have very different ways of getting there. For the classical liberal, recall, what they thought needed to do was, what needed to happen, was for government to protect some very basic securities that people needed so they could be free. They had to protect people from death and thieves and things like, not death, from murderers, from thieves, things like that. And other than that, it should just leave people alone to do what they wanted with their lives. And in that way, they'd be the most free. You're going to see that modern liberalism is very different. I'll explain it by discussing three tenets of modern liberalism. So let's begin to discover the first by going to the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote about his views in a book called The Social Contract. Now, Rousseau, you can probably tell by the name of his book, was a social contract theorist, like Hobbes and Locke, who you've previously met in this course. He imagined a world without government, and then tried to work through mentally what the result of that would be. But he differed from Hobbes and Locke in what he saw as being the great difficulty of a world without government. You can see in this quote from Rousseau that what he imagined was the problem of a world in which people were completely free from government to do anything they wanted was a lack of equality. And the reason he thought that was he wanted people to be free and have liberty, but he thought that that would be impossible without equality. Now, to understand why he might think this, because it's so different from what classical liberals thought when we discussed the term liberal previously in the course, let me use kind of an extreme example. Might it be nice to just hop on a plane and fly to Jamaica tonight and watch the sunset there? Sure, that might be a fun thing to do. But can you do that if you want to? Probably not. I'm guessing most people that will be listening to this lesson do not have the financial resources to just hop on a plane and go. But there are people that do have those kind of resources, where they make a decision like that and they can just go and do it. Well, from a certain point of view, do those people have more liberty than you do? Of course they do. And so there's an inequality of liberty there. Some people have more freedom than others because they have more stuff than others. And so for people to have freedom, they need to have a certain amount of economic ability to enjoy that freedom. And it wasn't just Rousseau who started thinking about freedom in these ways, but his ideas spread. And by the early 1900s, they were prominent here in the United States also. An example of this is found in the views of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was president of the United States in the 1930s and the 1940s. He came into office during the time of the Great Depression, when economic concerns were great in the country. People were really worried about there being lots of poor, and in that sort of environment, there was concern about the few rich people having too much while others starved, etc. Well, in that environment, Franklin Roosevelt talked about His belief, you can see this is very much like Rousseau, that individual freedom can't exist without economic security. And he described it this way. He said, necessitous men are not free men. Now, what that word necessitous means is people who are focused on their needs. So we'll use an extreme example to illustrate this. Imagine that your life consisted of waking up in the morning and going to work and working the entire day from dawn till dark, doing a job that barely paid enough for you to eat enough that you wouldn't starve. And then when you finished working that day, you would go and fall down on your bed and you would sleep through till the next morning when you would get up and go back to the same job and work to earn barely enough to feed yourself and then fall down exhausted again the next night. And that's what your life consisted of day after day. Are you free? Well, from one point of view, you can argue that you're definitely not free, that you have become enslaved by your economic circumstances. Now, someone else might say you're still free. No one is by law putting a gun to your head and forcing you to go to that job. Theoretically, you could quit and go find another one, whatever. But in that moment, given the circumstances I described, arguably that person has no freedom. And so that's the kind of thing in the extreme that FDR is talking about here. The idea that people are focused on their needs doesn't allow them to pursue other things in their life. They lack freedom to choose to do other things. And so he felt it was important to give them a certain level of security that would allow them to do other things. You can see very much along the ideas of Rousseau. So what happened was liberalism evolved. Liberalism was always focused on liberty. But once people started accepting Rousseau's view, they started seeing economic inequality as an obstacle to this, that equality needed to be established in order for people to have freedom. So that gives us our first tenet of modern liberalism, that liberty requires equality. For people to really be free, they have to be, in certain ways, equal to each other. The next tenet of modern liberalism, we'll go back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau to get a quote from. In this quote, he describes that in order to overcome this problem of inequality, you can't allow either rich men or beggars. And the reason that he puts it that way, as you look at the rest of the quote, he feels that those kind of inequalities would take advantage of the economic system. The rich people would buy the votes of the poor people, so to speak, buy their allegiance, and in that way the rich people would become tyrants and freedom would be lost. So to get rid of that possibility, he wanted to get rid of both rich people and poor people. So from that idea, that goal, you have to then look around and think, okay, what makes people rich or poor? And it's really the economic opportunities that are out there in society that some people take better advantage of. Maybe they take better advantage of because they have greater opportunities. Maybe they were born wealthy already with rich parents that sent them to the best school and gave them the best jobs. Or maybe they were just creative in some way, or they were talented in some way, and they were able to sell a lot of things or perform in certain ways that earn them lots of money. Anyway, what happens is that people are able to become richer than others, and then Rousseau believes that that happening would lead to potentially a loss of freedom for everybody. So it's the ability to become richer than others, to go out there and get greater profit than others, owning more property than others, which is the essential problem here. So for a modern liberal, private wealth is the enemy of liberty. That some people can get rich while others are theoretically enslaved by their poverty is a thing that prevents everybody from enjoying liberty. We can look again to Rousseau for our next tenet, our last tenet that we're describing this lesson of modern liberalism. And that is that once you've decided that wealth inequality is the problem, that you don't want any more rich or poor people, then you've got to have some mechanism to correct it. And the only thing bigger enough and powerful enough to correct it will be the government. So in this quote, you see that Rousseau says that The circumstances of our world, with some people being more talented, some people being more capable, some people having more opportunities, leads to inequality. And that therefore the force of legislation, in other words, the power of government, needs to be used to maintain equality once you get to it. So he's imagining in some way creating equality, and then as the natural tendencies of the world try to make people unequal, the government's going to have to be constantly involved trying to keep people equal. So that gets us to our last tenet, and that is that while private wealth is the enemy of equality, big government is going to be the friend of equality. It's the one thing that's large enough, powerful enough to actually force people to behave in equal ways. So what a modern liberal is really trying to accomplish is use government power to redistribute wealth, and in doing that, redistribute freedom. Now, it's important to point out the redistributing freedom part here, because here's one of the potential criticisms of modern liberalism, that it's not really creating more freedom, it's simply shuffling it around. It's deciding that the rich guy with his plane to go to Jamaica has too much freedom, so we're going to take it away from him and give it to somebody else. And so freedom is spread around more, not necessarily that more of it exists. Now, another potential criticism of modern liberalism is that it can lead to extreme circumstances that many people would find very problematic. It can be seen in the writings of Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx was a communist. I'm not trying to say that modern liberals are communists, but the two ideological positions have some things in common. They're both concerned about human equality, and they're willing to mess around with freedom in order to create equality. And Karl Marx is willing to just go much farther in this vein. Quote from him, where he says that a communist is dedicated to the abolition of private property. In other words, getting rid of anybody owning private stuff. And he admits that in order to accomplish that, it's going to require despotic means. Now, you know what that word means from earlier in the course. We're talking about tyrannical means here. A bad king, a dictator. And Karl Marx says that's okay. That's what's going to be required, and actually to move all this wealth around to get it where it should be. So arguably, by abolishing property, what government control can potentially do when it redistributes freedom, it actually destroys freedom. And that's the danger in these attitudes of modern liberalism, socialism, communism that are all kind of together. Now, modern liberals would say, hey, don't worry about it. As long as we don't go too far that direction, we're okay. Yes, maybe we're giving up a little bit of total freedom in order to redistribute wealth around, but we give up that little bit of freedom in order to make more people have freedom. So freedom isn't just concentrated in a few wealthy people, it's distributed out to more people. And yes, it may require a heavy hand of government to do it, but it's worth it, is the argument they'd make. Now, there is one unusual thing about modern liberalism. While they seem to be in favor of a great deal of government control in certain areas, like economic stuff, which we've been focusing on this lesson, and even in social issues, for example, race relations, things like that, where they want people to be treated equally. They don't want people going around and criticizing others because of their lifestyle or their gender or their race or things like that. So they want to get a certain amount of control in many areas of people's lives. But there are areas where modern liberals want the government to stay out of, what we can call cultural choices. Things like, for example, abortion rights. They want women to be able to freely get abortions. Drug laws. They would like people to be able to use drugs if they wanted. And this can potentially seem contradictory. The modern liberals want the big hand of government in some areas, like what you can buy and sell, how much you can charge, how much money you can make, things like that. But they want government to stay out of whether or not you choose to smoke pot, for example. But from the modern liberal point of view, this isn't a contradiction, because in both cases, they are focused on liberty. Just in one case, they think that the government needs to step in to help people be more free, and in the other, they think that you're free on your own. Oops, went the wrong way. Okay, there we go. for Rousseau, what does liberty require? Does it require anarchy? Does it require universal agreement? Does it require discrimination? Or does it require equality? Now, we've talked about it so much, the obvious answer should be for him, it requires equality. Now, once you've decided that you want to, or is it private profits, people out there making money on their own? Or is it religious organizations? Or is it the educational priorities in our society? Well, as I already accidentally flashed, but you should know, the right answer is government regulations. I went the wrong way. The thread of equality is government regulations. The government steps in and straightens out the inequalities, uses its great force and power to make people more economically equal. Then if they're controlling all those things, then what do modern liberals not want controlled? Do they not want minimum wages? Do they not want hateful speech controlled? Do they not want environmental pollution controlled? Or do they not want marijuana use controlled? Well, the right answer, as I mentioned a few moments ago during the lesson, is that they're okay with people being free to choose for themselves whether to smoke pot. But they, in fact, want to tell businesses how much they can pay their workers. They want to tell people what words they're not allowed to say that some may find hurtful. They want to tell people what sort of pollution they can release into the environment. But you can put what drugs you want into your own body. And then the last review question is, what other term is used for liberals? Communist. Well, if somebody used that, they'd be trying to insult them and claiming that they're totalitarians like Karl Marx. Or progressive, or fascist, or libertarian. The right answer is progressive, as we saw at the end of the lesson. There it is. All right. That does it for this lesson about modern liberalism. The next lesson will be lesson 14 of Unit 1 about modern conservatism.